And so, good afternoon. Today we study lecture 1, Introduction to Econometrics. And this is chapters about introduction. So, in the case you don't understand some points here, so it's very fine, very normal. Because in the next lectures we will explain in more details what we have studied in this lecture. Okay, so the you already studied the subject the statistics and macroeconomics or microeconomics, and now we study econometrics. So maybe you could ask ask yourself, what are the difference among these subjects? So here I give you an example, so you can have some first idea or like some brief idea of the difference among these subjects. For example, we want to analyze two variables, income and consumption expenditure of households. And in statistics, normally we care about if these two variables has relationship or not. If yes, what kind of relationship, like positive or negative? So how we can know? First, there's some ways to analyze the relationship between these two variables. The first method is to draw the graph. So given the data set, you can draw the graph with the, like a consumption expenditure as vertical axis and income as the horizontal axis. So in the case when we have graph, if the graph is upward sloping, so it means that income and consumption expenditure go in the same direction. Or in other words, income and consumption expenditures has a positive relationship. So when income increase, so the consumption expenditure will increase too. Okay. Or in other words, we can say income has a positive effect on consumption expenditure. Okay. So the second method, you can calculate the correlation coefficients. If the correlation coefficient is greater than 0, so that means they have a positive relationship. So, this is in statistics when we want to analyze two variables. So normally we want to see if these two variables has relationship or not. Okay, but in term in economics, for example, in microeconomics, when we know that like income and consumption expenditures has a positive relationship. So how we can explain this relationship? And normally we explain like this: an increase in income will raise consumption expenditure, other things being equal. So other things being equal, here we have these terms. What it means? It means that according to economists, besides income, there are many other factors could affect consumption expenditures. But if we want to see only the effect of income on consumption expenditure, so we need to keep the other thing fixed or being equal. Okay, so we just let income like a change, and the other thing have to be fixed. So that means we are calculating, we are considering the partial effect or the marginal effect or the partial effect of income on consumption expenditure. But in econometrics, we want to know more. Okay, we know that income and consumption expenditures has the positive relationship. Okay, but we want to know more. We want to know if if income increase by $1 or 1 unit. So how much unit? How many units the consumption expenditure will increase? That means we need to find out this number 0, for example, 0.67 here. So in econometrics, we want to quantify the relationship between income and consumption expenditure. So with this example, so you can have the first idea of like the scope of the subjects on and the purpose of the subjects, like statistics, economics, and econometrics. Yeah, and this slide talk about the definition. So the definition of econometrics is very broad here. Econometrics is based on the development of statistical methods for estimating economic relationship, testing economic theories, evaluating government and business policies. Okay. So you can see that like econometrics based on the developments of statistics methods. So that's why last time I said to you that like some methods like for hypothesis testing, we were like based on that kinds of methods you already study in statistics for the econometrics. Yeah, and here is the aim or the purpose of the subjects. So how is more or less like the expected outcomes of the subjects last time we talked about, right? Like we use econometrics model in the case we want or to quantify. So to quantify the relationship among economics variables. Okay, quantify lượng hóa em nhé. That means we need to find the number. We need to find the number to see if when independent variable increase by 1 unit, how many units the dependent variable will change. Okay, so we need to find out that number. Or in other words, we in the case we want to quantify the relationship among economics variable, we can use econometrics model. And we use econometrics model to test the economic theories. For example, you study many theories in macroeconomics or in microeconomics. For example, in macroeconomics, you study like theories about you study the contents or the components of the GDP, something like this. So that means which factor can affect the GDP of a countries. So in the theories, you already know all the factors, and now you want to test that theories with the real data. So you need to collect the data of the countries in the world over times, for example, like this, and you run the econometrics model. So you have a conclusion to see, okay, if all these factors can affect GDP of countries or not. So that means in the case you want to test economic theories, you can use econometrics model. And we use econometrics model to, in fact, to evaluate the impact of one variable on the other variable. Or in other words, in fact, it is like we quantify the relationship. And we use econometrics model to find the evidence, and based on that evidence or based on the results, we can provide a policy recommendation. For example, like when we study when you study in high school or secondary school, when you sort of mathematics exercise, you have some results, and you just keep like that, right? You don't need to explain much about that number. But when we study in university as students, when we have a number, so we need to read to understand why we have this kind of number, or what this number, what story this number can talk to you, can tell you. Okay, so the point that it means based on the number, you have to say something, you have to provide a policy, you have to provide an explanation. Okay, so if you want to have if you want to provide any policy for let's say for a company, for an organization, for countries, you need to provide evidence. That means you need to provide data. Okay, so the point that we use econometrics model to quantify the relationship among economics variables is not only to quantify that kind of relationship, but based on the number we get, we can provide the policy recommendation. For example, here back to this slide here. So we know that like when US dollar increase by, like when income increased by $1 US, so the consumption expenditure increased by 0.7 US dollar, for example, like this. So that means income in, so that means when we want to increase consumption expenditure, we have to increase our income. That is like a solution. Okay. Or when you you can quantify the relative of factors affecting GDP of a countries. So in the case so what is the kind of policy? So if we want to increase the GDP of a countries, what we have to do? Okay, so that means our policy suggestion need to based on the evidence. Okay, so in this case, the econometrics model can provide us the evidence. Yeah. And as last time when we talk about the econometrics, the outcome, the expected outcome of the subjects, and in fact these are the like is also the purpose of the subjects, right? And at the end of the course, when you can do the assignment, that means you need to cover all this kind of thing. So that okay, you already get the expected outcome of the course. That means you can set up econometrics model to quantify the relative of variables, and you can evaluate the impact of the variables on the others variable, and then you can provide the policy suggestion based on the estimated results you get. Okay. So here, this slide show you the steps you need to use, you need to carry out in the case you want to apply econometrics model for analysis. And this slide is very important. So if anybody here already print out the lectures, so you should highlight this slide, because we will come back to this slide many times during the course. When we finished any step, I will come back to this slide and say, okay, we already finished this step. So when we finish all the steps, that means we finish the course. And when you do the assignment, you need to follow the step so that you can, I mean, you have no like, mistake when you do the assignment. And in this slide, you can see we have 9 steps. But step 9, we can do or we don't want to do is fine. It's not like obligation. It's not. But from step 1 to step 8, you need to do. You have to do. Okay, to complete a report using econometrics model. So from step 1 to step 8, you have to do. And step 9 depends on you want to do or you don't want to do, is okay, it's fine. And step 6 here, you can see I highlighted the red color. Because why? Because when we finish step 5, I will move to we will jump to step 7. And after studying step 7, we come back to study step 6. Because why? Because to understand the consequence of the problem of the model in step 6, we need to understand the how to test the hypothesis, because all the problems in the step 6 will affect the results of the hypothesis test. So we need to understand how to test hypothesis first, so we can understand the consequence of the problem in step 6. So, but when you already understand the contents of all the steps, when you do the assignment, you need to follow the step in order. That means when you do assignment or you do any research paper using econometrics model, you have to follow all the steps in order like this. The way to write a research paper and to write an assignment of the subjects could be different. Even you also follow the step like this, but the way you write, the way of writing could be different. So at the end of the course, I will talk to you these things. Okay. And so now I go to explain to you in more details the contents of each step. And as I said to you, many points now you could not understand because it's introduction. So you don't have to be worried if you don't understand some points. Okay, here. So step one. Step one, the question of interest. So as a beginning, you need to decide what you want to do, which topic you want to analyze, what you want to do. For example, when you do the assignment, the group need to decide what you want to analyze. So the idea of the topics comes from the subjects you have studied in the program, or come from like the experience, the social experience, or from the observation. Okay. For example, when you study like the microeconomics, and you study about the behavioral theories, something like this, or like the firms, you study the quantities function of firm, something like this, and you have idea, okay, you want to analyze like a factor affecting the quantities of the outcome of the firms or the performance of the firms, or you want to analyze like factor affecting the ZPA or the ZDP, the ZDP growth of countries in the world. So this kind of idea come from like the subjects, macroeconomics or microeconomics. Or you want to analyze something about the stock market, right? Or I mean, so you can have many ideas. Okay. So that means at the beginning, you need to decide what you want to do, what you want to analyze. Okay. For example, here, we want to, in microeconomics, like we study the theories of Keynes. Keynes is a very English, very famous English economist. And hundreds years ago, when he observed the households in England, he has a statement like this: the consumption of households has a positive relationship with their income. So this is the statement of Keynes hundreds years ago by observing the households in England. So now we want to test these theories in the present time, in the real life, or in the case of Vietnam and at present time. So that means we need to collect the data of the households on consumption and income of households, for example, in Vietnam in year 2020. So we want to test these theories in this time and in the case of Vietnam. So this is the question of interest or the topic we want to analyze. Yeah. So in step 2, we have to set up mathematics model. And step 3, we have to set up econometrics model. Here I introduce to you both mathematics model and econometrics model. So you can see the difference between these two models. But when you already master all the steps, so you can skip step 2. That means when you can jump from step 1 to step 3, you can skip step 2. But here I here I introduced to you step 2 because I want you to see the difference between mathematics model and econometrics model. So this is a mathematics model. So we want to test the hypothesis as the relationship between income and consumption, right? And so we can set up a function like this. And this function, this mathematics model, reflect exact relationship between consumption and income. This model reflects exact relationship between consumption and income. And if we expect that income has positive effects on consumption, that means we expect the beta 1 here, the coefficient, the slope coefficient here, must be greater than 0 or positive. Okay, and so here you have to remember some name, some notation like beta 0, beta 1 here are parameters or coefficients, tham số hoặc là hệ số. Sách giáo khoa người ta dùng đôi chỗ parameter, đôi chỗ coefficient thì các em chú ý nó đều chỉ một cái đối tượng. Dạ. Đó. Tiếp đến này. And beta 0 is constant of intercept parameters, tham số cố định hoặc tham số chẵn. And beta 1 is slope parameter, tham số góc hoặc là hệ số góc. Dạ. And so now we move to the econometrics model in step 3. So according to the econometric science say that besides income, there are many other factors that can affect consumption, expenditures of households. Because of some reasons, we do not include them in the model, but it doesn't mean that they do not exist. So that means when we calculate the effect of income on consumption, we need to consider the existence of the other factors besides income. Okay. So that's why the econometric science success the model like this. So this is the econometrics model. So here you can see the term, the factor U here. In this model, in the econometrics model, we have a factor U. So factor U, the factor U here, represents factors that are not income but can affect consumption of households. Okay. So can you name me some factors besides income that can affect consumption of expenditures of households? Can you name some factors?
I think age and maybe the number of the family.
The number of the family member. Yes. Yeah. And
the age, độ tuổi.
Age of the family member.
Gender.
Yes. And more.
The interest.
Which one?
Their interest. So take it.
Their interest.
Yes.
Interest. Okay. Interest. Okay. Yes. And any more factor.
Kỳ vọng.
Kỳ vọng gì hả em? Expected income. Thu nhập kỳ vọng đúng không? Ví dụ kỳ vọng là trong năm chúng ta thu nhập được nhiều tiền từ chứng khoán chẳng hạn, thì năm nay chúng ta tiêu đi, đúng không? Ví dụ như thế, đúng không? Hoặc là sang năm chúng ta bảo thôi, chơi là dịch bệnh như này, sang năm thu nhập giảm đây, thôi thắt chặt chi tiêu, đúng không ạ? Đấy, đúng rồi, kỳ vọng về thu nhập kỳ vọng. Well, so okay, you already can, besides income, you already name like some factors that can affect consumption of households, like the number of the family member, or the age of the family members, or like the expected income or living place of the family, right? So on. So that means besides income, we have many other factors that can affect consumption expenditures of households. But because of some reasons, we did not include them in the model. So all such factors will be content in you. Will be in you. So you here cover all the kinds of factors. So later on, when we study, we will see that there are so many assumptions for this factor, for the factor U, so that when we estimate or when we calculate the value beta 0 and beta 1, we already consider the existence of those factors. Okay, so you can see here this model. This is Ecometrics. This Ecometrics model is different from the mathematics model because this model do not reflect like the perfect relationship between consumption and income. Okay, but the mathematics model reflect like the perfect or the exact relationship between consumption and income. So here, and here we have a points like the choice of variables to include in the model based on economics theories and available data. So for example, we have a topic like analyze factors affecting consumption expenditures of households in Vietnam, right? For example, we have for example, we want to analyze the factors affecting consumption expenditure household in Vietnam, right? So if we have a topic like this, I am explaining to you this point here in the slide as a choice of variables to include in the model based on economic theories and the available data or the availability of the data. So I'm explaining to you this point. For example, we have a topic like this, and we want to analyze factors affecting consumption expenditures of households in Vietnam. Okay, so with this topic, the dependence variable must be consumption expenditure. Consumption expenditures, right? So this is the dependent variable. Consumption expenditures. But when which factors could affect the consumption expenditure? You just name some, right? Like the first one, income of the family, income of the income. Second one is a number as a member in that family, right? And then we have the living place, and we have like the age, users test the age members. So we can see that, so on. Of course, there are many more. So how we can know which factors, would include in the model, which factor can affect the consumption expenditure. How can you know this? So normally you need to read the theory. For example, you need to these theories, or the theory here could be like that means you need to review the literatures on these topics. So you have to read theories about this topic, and you need to read the research paper on this topic, like previous research paper on these topics, to see, okay, in terms of the theories, which factors could affect the consumption expenditures. Okay. That means which factors that can affect consumption expenditure already named in the theory. Okay. Or according to the previous research paper. So which factors, like the authors already like point out which factors could affect the consumption expenditures. That means we need to base on the literature review to decide which factor could be included in the model. Yeah. So the point that it means that we don't select the variable by random. We have some base, we have a background to choose the variable, to choose a factor. Or like when you want to analyze like the factor affecting the GDP of countries. So these things you already study in macroeconomics. Okay. And based on the theories, you already study in that subjects. And normally that kind of theories was, I would say, pointed out by some authors. So normally you have to mention the name of authors. This thing I will talk to you more when you have to write the assignment. So maybe you can learn the experience when you have to do the thesis. Because when you do the thesis at the end of the program to create the program, so you have to write the thesis, right? And literature review is one of the most important part of a thesis. Yeah. So I will talk about this later when I show you how to write the assignment or the research paper of the course, for the course. So here you just understand that when you decide which factor should be included in the model, so you need to have some base. You need to base on the theories, and also based on the availability of the data. Because why? Because by the theories, we know very well that the number of the member could affect the consumption expenditures. But when we go to collect the data on the number of the family, the number of the members of the family, we don't have information on this variable. So we cannot include it in the model. Okay. So because why? Because most of the time in statistics or in econometrics, we have to collect the data from the other sources. We cannot do the questionnaire. We cannot do the survey by ourselves. It is too difficult and it takes time and also finance. So we cannot cover, right? So that's why normally we get data from like a professional organization. And in the case they did not do the survey on that factors, so we cannot get the data. So we cannot include that variable in the model. Yeah. So this is the explanation to this point here in the slide. And here are some here are the reasons for the existence of error term. So we just talk about, like, we are talking about the econometrics model, and you can see the existence of error term here. So here are some the main reasons for the existence of error term. So the first reason, like, the researchers cannot know all the factors that affect dependence variable. You cannot know, you cannot name that factors. You cannot know. For example, we want to analyze the FDI attractions, the determinant to the FDI attractions to provinces in Vietnam, right? And so, for example, like some province, they can attract a lot of foreign investor, and some province cannot. And there's so many reasons. And one of the reasons could be like the positions or the history factors or historical factors of that province, for example. But we cannot find any variable. We cannot name that variable. We cannot find any measurements, any good measurements for that factors. So that means we cannot name that factors. We don't know how to measure that factors, so we cannot include them in the model. Or some factors like intangible, or invisible. They exist, but like we cannot name them. So in this case, we cannot include that factors in the model. Or in other words, we can say that we cannot know all the factors. The second reason is that it is impossible to get data for all factors, as I just said to you. In the case, you know for sure that this factor could affect the dependence variable, but because we cannot get data, so we cannot include them in the model. We don't have data, we cannot do anything. Yeah, data here, or in other words, is information. Yeah, and the last reason is that it becomes very complicated if we include all the variables in the model. For example, you can name like many factors that can affect consumption expenditure. Some have very strong effects. Some have very weak effect. So normally we don't include too many variables in the model because it is too complicated to analyze. But normally we just focus on some main factors. Okay. So with these reasons, the error terms always exist. The error term always, the factor U always exists. Yeah, in the econometrics model. So when we estimate the coefficients, we need to consider the existence of the error term. Yeah. And now we move to step 4, data collection. Chúng ta break một chút nhé, chúng ta nghỉ một chút đi các em.
Ôi cô, vừa nãy em lúc cô điểm danh xong em vào luôn nhé.
Tên gì em?
Em tên là Bùi Thị Hiền ạ.
Vâng, cả em nữa có cùng ở đây giống bạn Hiền ạ. Em tên Đỗ Anh Quân.
Vâng. Dạ.
Vâng.
Em break một chút đi ạ. Chữ Hàn Quốc các em nhé. Step 4, data collection. Okay, so now we already have Econometrics model. So now we need to collect the data. So here we have to collect data on consumption and income of households, right? So for as we just know that data is really important. If we don't have data, we cannot do anything, right? So that's why when we even data collection is in step 4, but in fact in step 1, when we decide the topic of the research, you already have to think about, have to look for the data. Because for example, if you are very interested in one topic, but you cannot get data, so you cannot do anything. For example, when you have to do the thesis to at the end of the program, like in the fourth year, right? When you want you before crediting the program, you need to do the thesis, and normally the supervisor will ask you if you have data or not. Yeah. So it means that data is very important, and when you as a time you decide the topic you want to do, you already have to look for the data. The data has two kinds of data: primary data and secondary data. Primary data is kind of data that you collect by yourself, and secondary data is the kind of data you can collect from the other sources. But normally we have to collect data from the other sources, because normally we don't have enough experience, don't have enough time, finance to make a survey. Normally like that. So that's why, for example, in the case in Vietnam, we get data from the General Statistics Office, Tổng cục Thống kê, GSO, and some other organization. And sometimes you have to buy the data if the data is not open source. So you have to buy the data. Or you can get some data about the countries in the World Bank data, World Bank data. And there are so many other sources you can get the data. And then when you get the data, you need to see the structures of economic data, of the data. Because why? Depends on the structures of the data, we will have different kind of econometrics model. There are some main econometrics model, and each econometrics model is the best for like a certain kinds of data set. Here, so understand, it is important to understand the structures of data. For example, here there are three kinds of the data. Here, the first one is a cross-sectional data, dữ liệu chéo. And we have a full cross-sectional data, dữ liệu chéo gộp. And we have a time series data, dữ liệu chuỗi thời gian. And we have a panel data, dữ liệu bảng. Okay. And here we time series dữ liệu chuỗi, and we have panel data, dữ liệu bảng or dữ liệu mảng. So cross-sectional data, cross-sectional data is data that was taken at a given point of time. Vậy dữ liệu chéo là cái dữ liệu mà được lấy ở một cái thời điểm cụ thể. Đấy. So here's an example. Here's an example of a cross-sectional data on each journal's characteristic in 2020. So that means in 2020, we did a survey on like 30 individuals, and we asked them some information like the consumption, income, gender, education, and marriage situation. Yeah, so this is a cross-sectional data set because it was taken in 2020. And this is also a cross-sectional data set on provinces characteristics. Like this data set was taken in 2006. And we get information about provinces in Vietnam like FDI, ODA, population, industrial zone, and mountain regions or not. Okay, so this is a cross-sectional data set because it was taken in 2006 in a given year. And here in this slide, there's a point here. Sometimes different variables can correspond to different time periods in cross-sectional data set. So có nghĩa là gì ạ? Đôi khi thì những cái biến khác nhau có thể tương thích với những thời gian, thời điểm khác nhau trong một cái bộ dữ liệu chéo. Đó. Có nghĩa là một cái bộ dữ liệu chéo có thể có những cái nhiều biến khác nhau, và mỗi một cái biến có thể được lấy ở những thời điểm khác nhau, không nhất thiết phải giống nhau. So I explain to you this point. For example, we want to analyze factor affecting GDP of countries in the world. Normally, the data we get the latest data, the most updated data. So how we can explain to you this point, like the different variable can correspond to different time periods in cross-sectional data set. Okay, so here we have the countries. So we have like all the countries in the world, or most of the country in the world, USA, China, and so on, many countries. So factors affecting GDP of countries in the world. So the dependence variable must be GDP of the countries. So now is here at the beginning of the year 2022, right? So we can get information. The latest data could be in 2020. So GDP, which factor could affect GDP of a countries? Can you name some? Can you name some factors? Nào các bạn thử nói cho cô biết rằng yếu tố nào có thể ảnh hưởng đến GDP của một quốc gia? Interest.
Salary.
What?
Salary.
Okay, and cái này các em học trong mắt
Consumption.
Thuế rồi.
tax, consumption, tiêu dùng. And population, right? Dân số, or labor, something like this. Okay, so on. Many other factors, right? For example, and you here, for example, like a GDP, normally GDP, we can get information on GDP every year for all the countries in the world. We can go to the World Bank data, we can get information about on GDP of all countries every year. So for example, we can get information on GDP, on salary, I don't know these meanings, I mean, but salary or tax rate, or like the total tax, income tax of the country, something like this. And or the export tax or import tax, something, many kinds of tax. So for example, on this variable, we can get data in 2020. That means the latest information we can get. But for population, normally the population, each country will have like the surveys on the population like each 5 years. They don't do every year because it takes a lot of money. It consumes a lot of money. So for example, in 2020, we don't have information on population of Vietnam, and we get information about the population of Vietnam like in 2015 or 2016, right? So it's okay, it's fine. So the point that like it doesn't need it's not necessary that all the variable here in this data set must be investigated or must be surveyed in the same year. It could be in a different year. Okay. So, but you have to remember that when you collect the data, you should get the most updated data. Yeah. So, so here as the two example of the cross-sectional data, and in our course, we study the linear regression model that we study in the lecture 2, and in this course we only study that model, and this model is the best for the cross-sectional data. Yeah, because there are so many different kinds. There's main kinds of econometrics model, but we don't have enough time to study in one course. Okay, so for this course, we only have time to study one model, the most popular model, econometrics model, and this model is the best, most suitable for the cross-sectional data set. And we have a pool cross-sectional data, pool go apply. That means when we pool two or more than two cross-sectional data sets together, so we have a pool cross-sectional data. For example, in the year 2000, we made a survey on 200 houses in Hanoi. We survey the house price and the characteristics of the house, for example, number of bedrooms, the square, the location, many information of house in Hanoi. And the sample has 200 houses. And into 20 years later, in 2020, we made another survey on a sample of 200 houses, okay, on the same information. So these 200 houses in 2020 doesn't need to be the same with the 200 houses in 2000, is the year 2000. The sample could be different, okay, but the information, okay, the variable must be the same, the house price, number of bedrooms, the square or the location of the house, and other informations. And so that means we have one sample in the year 2000 and one sample in the year 2020. So when we pool these two samples together, so we have a pool cross-sectional data, right? And the pooling these two data sets together just to increase the sample size, Okay, now we move to time series data. Dữ liệu chuỗi thời gian. So time series data set consists of observation on a variable or several variables over time. That means we observe the observation over times. Yeah. So normally, like the variable of stock market, the stock market index, or like exchange rate, or consumer price index. This kind of variable normally are time series data. Yeah. So here, this is a time series data on consumption and income of a person over years. So here we get information from the year 1982 to 1996. Years ago, many years ago, right? Very old information. But it doesn't matter when we now we just explain the definition of a time series data. So here the time must be in order from the past to present. Okay, here you can see. So this is a time series data. And this is a time series data too on countries on FDI and ODA of countries. Data on FDI and ODA of countries. So from the year 1990 to the year 2007. So this is a time series data. Yep. And panel data. Panel data is like a mix of time series and partial data. And we observe panel data. That means we have to observe the same sample over time. In the pool cross-sectional data, the sample no need to be the same. But in panel data, the sample must be the same over time. So here, for example, we observe 64 provinces of Vietnam for 3 years, from 2004 to 2006. That means we observe the same sample over 3 years, right? So this is a panel data. Yeah, or like you can observe the panel data is very popular in research because the panel data permit us to know the change of the variable or the change of the observation over time. And we can see how like the change in the society, the change in the economy could affect the change of like the observation. So if we can observe like a group of sample over time, so we can understand the effect of the factors on like the relationship among the variables over time. So sometimes it is very interesting. Yeah. So we can see that. So as I said to you, when you get data, you need to see the structures of the data set so you can decide the econometrics, the suitable econometrics model. Because we have different kinds of different econometrics model for different kinds, for different structures of the data. Okay, so this thing you have to be careful when we design the econometrics model. And so we know that the data is very important. If we don't have data, we cannot do anything, right? And the data must be reliable. So that's why when you get data, you always need to mention the source of the data. This is very important. So the reader can see that, okay, the data you analyze here is reliable or not. But if the data is not reliable, so the result of the research is not reliable. So that's why when you collect the data by yourself, you need to guarantee that the method to select the sample is right, is scientific. Okay, or if you don't do the survey by yourself, you collect the data from the other sources, you need to be guaranteed that that sources or that organization that provide you the data is professional or has functions in doing or in collecting the data. This is very important. And sometimes one variable, the same variable, but you collect it from different kinds, different resources, the value could be different. For example, the FDI inflow, like from direct investment inflow into countries in the world. If you get this information from like Ustad, or you get this information from World Bank or from ITC, International Trade Center. So the value could be different for each country because why? Because the method, the definition of FDI inflow of these three organizations are different. So you have to be very careful. Okay, so that's why normally for one variable, you need to get data from the same sources. For example, you get that GDP, the information on GDP of countries in the world. But when you get GDP of Vietnam from the source, the World Bank data. So for the USA, you also need to get the GDP from World Bank data. Because why? For example, GDP growth of Vietnam. If you read the report, you can see that the GDP growth of Vietnam by years, if according to the report of IMF or of World Bank, the number could be different already. Because the way they calculate the GDP growth is different, or like the definition or the way they calculate the GDP growth could be different among organizations. So that's why to guarantee the consistency of the measurement, so we should each variable, the data of each variable should be taken from the same sources. Yeah. So here, vậy hôm nay cô sẽ dừng hôm nay ở đây nhá, và buổi sau chúng ta sẽ học tiếp. Và buổi sau thì chúng ta gặp ở trên trường, đúng không ạ, học trực tiếp rồi nha các em nhé. Thế và yêu cầu là bạn nào hôm nay mà chưa in những cái gì mà cô yêu cầu đấy thì đề nghị các bạn in những cái tài liệu cô yêu cầu ra nhá. Và hôm nay chúng ta nghỉ đây ạ.
Dạ cô ạ.
Chào các em. Rồi, chào các em nhé.